If you like your games to look like a Golden Age SNES title, well, my friend, you're in luck. Because today I'll be reviewing Enter the Gungeon. Enter the Gungeon is a procedurally generated bullet hell dungeon crawler. What does that mean? That means it's kind of like Binding of Isaac. And personally, I was not a fan of Binding of Isaac because it was very cartoony looking, and as you went on, there were all these little sperm looking things flying around your head. And yeah, that game just didn't click with me. And I feel like a bolt of lightning is going to strike me out of the sky for saying that, but yeah, I was not a fan of Binding of Isaac, but let me tell you, Enter the Gungeon, I freaking loved it. And yeah, if you're curious, I did my entire playthrough on the PC using a Nintendo Switch Pro controller because this thing absolutely kicks ass for retro games. I mean, it's good for all games, but retro games, this thing, one of the best controllers I've ever used. Anyway, let's get started.
What makes Enter the Gungeon so unique is that it takes this sort of familiar 2D dungeon crawling experience, but instead of a standard medieval motif, we get this really cool world centered entirely around guns, shooting, bullets, and all things related. Seriously, everything from the enemies to the loading screens to the menu screens to the freaking elevator that carries you between floors is in the shape of a bullet, a gun chamber, or even a gun itself. The other thing that makes this game stand out from the crowd is the insane volume of usable guns and items. I'm not kidding, there's about 190 guns and 200 items to play around with. Even after I dropped about 75 hours or so into this game, there's still a truckload of them I never got to use, either because I didn't unlock them or, random chance didn't put them in my path. Onto the aesthetics. In a market so completely saturated with retro pixel art, it's pretty tough to stand out. But you'd pretty much have to be insane not to admit that the art looks pretty cool. The animations are all done very well, and each of the 5 floors have a distinct look to them. Some enemies are repeated with just a palette swap, red to blue, green to whatever, the shotgun shell guys being the biggest offenders, but generally there's enough variety, especially between the floors, that the enemies never really feel too repetitive. The best part about the art, however, is probably the guns themselves. Each one not only feels unique, but also sports an easily identifiable graphic, which isn't the easiest thing to do in a retro pixel art game. Seeing a pixelated version of a gun ripped right out of pop culture, such as the Ghostbusters Proton Pack or Mega Man's Mega Buster, makes the little kid inside of me giddy. And it's just a good feeling to see something you recognize in this game. Maybe it's just human nature, who knows. The sound. The guns themselves sound pretty good. And while I wish I could say that each one had its own individual firing sound, that simply isn't the case. Most of the handguns, for example, sound the same, as do the shotguns, the beam weapons, etc. You get the picture. A gun in the same class usually sounds like every other one in that class. But that's not the biggest flaw, it didn't really bother me. So, thankfully, however, these sounds border on, being adequate to pretty good. So, maybe not enough variety, but they all sound pretty good. I was pleased. The music outside of the vocalized opening and ending track, which is, fantastic, is decent, but ultimately forgettable. Honestly, as I type this review, I can't remember what the actual music sounds like. Oh well. Some of the extra sounds, like a barrel of poison bursting onto the floor, or a heavy table flipping over, are done especially well and worth mentioning. Overall, the audio is a mixed bag that sometimes impresses and sometimes doesn't. The story. Story-wise, Enter the Gungeon sits in a really strange place. The only stories to really speak of are the unlockable ones for each class, and even then, you only get to play them after a certain criteria is met. One of them being that you've already defeated the final boss, so needless to say, the story elements in this game are sparse, but not completely absent. It's there if you want it. However, I must digress, because it simply wouldn't be fair to judge this game based on its lack of story, because clearly that's not the point of the game. It's not driven by the story, And personally, instead of feeling like a negative, I feel like it's a bonus that they included any story at all. So yeah. Now, onto the gameplay. The gameplay itself is wonderful and is the true star of Enter the Gungeon. In addition to aiming and using your gun's specific gimmick successfully, you're also tasked with dodging a shit ton of bullets. I'm not kidding, there are a lot of bullets. Everywhere. Anyway, you dodge these bullets in a variety of ways, such as taking advantage of cover, which you might have just created by flipping a table over, or dodge rolling, which makes you briefly invulnerable and allows you to pass right through the bullets. But I suppose you're supposed to say, you jumped over the bullets or whatever. I don't know. Doesn't matter. Either way, it lets you dodge these bullets and not take any damage. So, not only is dodge rolling incredibly important, but it's quite frankly the game's defining quality. A run's success depends entirely on your ability to consistently dodge the bullet patterns. Thankfully, doing this is a whole lot of fun, and even reminded me at times a little bit of Dark Souls. The sense of accomplishment you get from taking down a boss without taking any damage for the first time feels good, and they even give you a little trophy for it, so that's nice. And the trophy, later on becomes part of the quest to, skip floors, which is pretty cool too, so not only is a flawless, boss encounter make you feel good, but it's also, important to progressing in the game. The game's difficulty, paired with the seemingly endless variety of weapons, makes playing Enter the Gungeon a really rewarding experience, and it kept me coming back over and over again for more punishment. Not to mention the unlockables are spread out pretty nicely to give you literally a reason to do another dungeon crawl. Maybe this run I'll get to try out the mailbox gun that fires envelopes, or the alien jet engine that pushes you around the room at supersonic speeds, or even the barrel gun that fires fish and stuns enemies. There are a lot of joke guns, but that doesn't mean that they don't perform well. Every gun, for the most part, performs well. If you wanted, you could even complete the game with the starting weapon. Although, I guess that would be a huge pain in the ass, because I didn't want to try it, but I'm sure somebody out there's done it. But figuring out each of these guns' strengths and weaknesses is pretty fun to do, and is a major part on why I kept coming back and playing more. My final thoughts. I really enjoyed this game. It honestly wasn't easy to pry my greedy little fingers off the controller well into the AM hours of the morning. Just one more run. Just one more, I would tell myself over and over again, hitting the retry button for the 7th time. If I didn't have to force myself to move on to new games to review, I'd probably keep playing this for a while longer. If not months to years longer. It's simply that good. Enter the Gungeon offers some of the best 2D gunplay out there, so if you're a fan of the genre, this one's basically a no-brainer. I found it to be challenging, but not brutally so. It seems to strike that right balance between a quick arcade romp and a difficult invested dungeon crawler. I'd recommend it wholeheartedly to pretty much anybody. And that's why I'm giving it a final score of 8.5 out of 10.